I'm Shauna Rosner, your host of In-House Counsel Chronicles, a podcast designed to chronicle the career journeys of in-house counsel so we can collectively learn from their unique paths to their in-house position, the challenges they've overcome, the milestones they have celebrated, and how they're shaping the future of law in today's rapidly changing business environment. Today, my guest is Omair Khan. Omair received his BA in Economics and Government from the University of Texas at Austin, as well as an MPA in Accounting with a focus on tax from the University of Texas at Austin, and his JD from Cornell Law School. Omair started his legal career in tax and big law before moving in-house, and then worked in startups and in healthcare software spaces. Welcome to the podcast, Omair.
No, appreciate being here, Shauna. Thank you.
Looking forward to our conversation today. And I want to start off by asking you, why did you decide to go to law school, and how did you decide on becoming a tax lawyer to start?
It's not a great answer. And the truth is I started off as pre-med. And I just found it very boring. It was just not that interesting. Like I was taking cell bio and I was like, this is not interesting to me. I got interested in the theory of government and economics. And that was interesting to me and intriguing. And in the process of doing that, that overlap is taxation, the power of the state, why the state taxes, what it does with the tax revenues. And all these questions were super interesting to me, but I also needed a job. And so I ended up doing the master's in accounting with the idea of being potentially be a tax accountant at a CPA firm. And in the process of doing that, it reaffirmed that I like the legal side of it more than the accounting side of it. I liked interpreting the regulations. I liked thinking about frameworks. I liked thinking about how to understand systems and how to apply systems. The accounting, so true accounting, wasn't as interesting to me. And so I went to law school to really be a tax lawyer. And so entered law school knowing that, and then ended up going to Baker McKenzie to start my career as in the tax controversy practice in Chicago.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. You started your legal career in tax litigation, correct?
Yep, that's right.
At Baker McKenzie, representing major tech companies. What was that experience like for you early on?
Yeah. I kind of stumbled into tax controversy. You're interviewing and they said they had a need, and it sounded interesting and actually was really fun and interesting. Baker represents a number of large pharma and tech companies in tax disputes with IRS. And it's very interesting to see the framework of how the IRS engages with taxpayers, and then also understanding how the taxpayers respond. And obviously there's lots of money at stake, billions of dollars are at stake, and they have resources to really pursue these claims. But it's also interesting to see these companies are very successful and how they became successful and how they allocate value and how they manage that success. And then obviously the IRS has a different viewpoint on that. And so it was a lot of fun and a lot of interesting work there while I was there.
And then I know you made a transition to Sidley, Austin, into transactional and tax work. How did you make that shift and why?
Yeah, I'd been at Baker for a couple of years, and I'd been doing the tax litigation, tax controversy practice there. But I was starting to feel that I wasn't learning some of the other aspects of the tax world, particularly around transaction, structuring, M&A. And it was just starting to feel that it's something I was looking for. And Sidley has actually opened up a Houston office, and they knew I was from Texas. And so, in part of those dialogues and conversations, I'd asked to get a more diversified experience in terms of my tax and grow my tax skill set and practice areas. And they were looking for someone to help support their practice in Houston. But I think it was about 40 or so attorneys at the time. So, and I was from Austin originally, and so it made sense. And a lot of things, stars lined up, and eventually I joined them in Houston and started doing that practice for a couple of years too. And that was a lot of fun too. Different, very different, but also different and fun in different ways.
So was there kind of a steep learning curve, or were you able to pick up the transaction side pretty quickly, or?
A bit of both. It's a very different type of tax practice in the sense that tax controversies is not the same as transactional M&A tax work. But at some level, it's not so different in the sense that you still have to get familiar with the tax code. You still have to understand the issues. You still have to understand the documents. The timing pressures are very different. In tax controversy, you have very long time horizons of these disputes. They take months, years, whereas in transactional work, you might get a request at 4 p.m. and have needed it done by tomorrow morning. And so it's just a very different type of tempo and pace, whereas in the controversy world, it's like, hey, we need to do this analysis. we have a week, very routinely 2 weeks. And that's like a soft deadline, not even a hard deadline. And so it was a very different tempo, very different pace. But it was also in some ways a different type of energy just because now you're dealing with like the corporate lawyers and corporate associates and partners coming by. And these are very live deals and they're about live transactions. So the pace is very different, but the demands are different. So it's different, but it was also like there was a transition for sure. I mean, it did involve really spending, evenings and weekends up leveling and learning a different area of tax that I wasn't as exposed to earlier in my career.
And then you made a transition in-house after Baker. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So after Sidley, and so
Sidley.
I had this idea I've been working on since law school, this like online tool to create custom prenups. Moved out to the Bay Area to chase it. Ended up not working out, but in that process, ended up started working with a company called Trusted Health, and then eventually joined them while they're raising their Series A. And that was my first foray in house. And it was really helping them with there were some tax sensitivities around how they like structured some of their products. And after I helped them with that, they wanted me to help with other issues. And eventually I joined them full time. And so it was very much stumbled into it. It was not intentional, actually. It was a little bit right opportunity, right moment. And just, it was just totally random in some ways. It was never the plan, but also I was very open to it and excited by it.
And what did Trusted Health do?
Yeah, so at its fundamental, it's a marketplace that connects traveling nurses to hospital systems on temporary assignments. And it's grown since then. While I was there, it was also grew into a SaaS software solution, basically a way to help clinical workforce management via AI platform, and then expanded beyond just travel nurses to other healthcare professionals too. So effectively, it's healthcare staffing, both as a marketplace, but also as a workforce management solution, and really trying to re-innovate in that space compared to your typical like healthcare staffing agencies and really bring tech forward and the best of consumer practices, thinking of the nurses as consumers. And so as part of that, this digital marketplace, this scaling business, they had a lot of things they wanted to innovate on. And one of the things they wanted to innovate on was how they paid nurses, how they make sure they got able to pay the nurses the most amount of money, tax issues around that, benefits issues around that. We provide nurses with different benefits and whatnot. That was unique at the time. And except we employ the nurses W2 employees. There's more complex tax frameworks around that. So a lot of innovation was happening on both on the product side that was tax sensitive. And so that's sort of how I initially got involved and then ended up joining them and was there for a number of years as we started in California and then scaled throughout California and then eventually nationally.
Yeah, I think you share with me that you were part of a significant COVID era
Yeah.
hyper growth.
Yeah,
Tell us
absolutely.
about that and how that type of scale affects the legal team.
Yeah, so I was the first legal hire. So I joined like when it was roughly 20 some employees, so very early on. And I joined pre-COVID. So we were growing, we were successful, we were pretty dynamic, exciting business. And then COVID happens. And COVID is an extreme accelerant. We grew dramatically because demand was so acute and it was such a huge issue and crisis, especially in healthcare staffing, especially for nurses, that it was a big drive for the business, but also a lot of pressure, a lot of demands. And so as part of that, we were scaling naturally with compliance issues. We also had nurse issues. Being a nurse is a very tough job. I think it's a tough environment to work in. Hospitals are not easy places to work in, especially during COVID. And so there's employment issues, there's risks and safety issues, there's drug issues, drug misappropriation issues. There's a lot of different challenges. And as we were dealing with all those challenges at the same time, we were securing licensure in different states. We were also going through different levels of different sorts of security certifications and other certifications to continue to allow our business to grow and mature. And so I ended up needing to grow the team, very much so initially with paralegal type support, and then scaling into compliance support, and then scaling on to additional legal support, particularly on employment law issues.
So how much did the legal team grow while you were there? How many did you have on your
Yeah, it
team?
started with just me. It started with zero,
Right.
one. I don't remember now. So effectively, we had a paralegal, a compliance manager, and then a legal assistant that grew into a paralegal. And then I had an employment lawyer, a senior employment lawyer. And I think that was the core team. And at another point, we also had our nurse payroll team report to me just because of nurse payroll being very legally sensitive and a lot of like novel legal issues and compliance issues were emerging. There was a time, a period where it made more sense for them to report to me. So about a total of a team of 10 at its peak.
Yeah, a significant growth. You described to me when we spoke earlier in preparation for this recording that you described yourself as a regulatory innovator. What does that mean in practice?
So the way I think of myself and the way I've sort of had opportunities that I've worked at and companies I've worked with is really thinking about companies that have looked at what is the traditional business model in a particular industry and space, particularly in regulated spaces, and really understand that just because something's been done the same way for 50 years does not mean it should be done the next 50 years the same way. And often that requires taking fresh eyes, looking at the laws, the legal frameworks, the systems, the guidance around those spaces, and also thinking about changes in the economy, changes in technology, changes in society, and then how do we build something new there? And often that requires us to really reimagine and rethink from the ground up. What does the law require? What does the law support? What do the regulators and regulations require and support? What do they need? What is their incentive? Not incentive. What is their insight into how they think about these legal frameworks and how they protect the consumer and the public versus how the consumer public has changed over the last 50 years? And so taking all that into account, you really try to think of like, how do you help companies navigate these things and navigate these challenges as they're trying to innovate and build new products? And so it requires a lot of thinking and understanding of regulatory frameworks and applying them in often new ways or applying them in ways they've never been applied before because technology's changed, right? The idea of a digital marketplace for healthcare staffing had never occurred before. And now is a new industry and now is a new space. And then the idea of like having a scale virtual business that was totally remote, healthcare staffing agency was novel and new. And so there's adaptations and innovations, and then hiring all these nurses as W-2 employees versus as contractors was a new innovation. That had also occurred as part of developments in employment law frameworks. So sometimes it's within the space you're in, sometimes it's technology, sometimes other legal frameworks have adapted and evolved. And so you're taking all these different pieces together and then trying to find a path that allows you as a company to build a new product and build something new that will also support the employees, the investors, and the consumers and the partners, and also the regulators, in the sense that it can withstand scrutiny, and that when investors invest in you or when acquirers look at you, they will diligence the legal frameworks and they will say, "Yep, this is not someone just saying things incorrectly, but it's actually supported by the law and regulations." And doing that in a way that makes sense and works and scales is hard.
Right.
And so that's and it's a very different skill set than I think typical legal practice.
Sure.
Which is a very different type of practice, and even typical in-house counsel, which I think is also oriented in a different way. So there's a little bit of a blend between those two.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that is really helpful to hear. And when you transitioned from Trusted Health, you moved to Iodine,
No,
correct?
actually, there's a company in between.
Okay, tell us
An
about that.
AI-powered. Yeah, so I'd been at Trusted for a number of years, and at a certain point, it was pre-COVID, COVID, post-COVID. I was ready for the next challenge and opportunity. And so I joined a health insurance startup, an AI-powered health insurance startup called Angle Health. And also very similarly looking to innovate on the product side. They're level funded. Well, they had different products, but they wanted to innovate on the level funded insurance plan, a lot of ERISA regulations and Department of Labor, Department of insurance issues. And so just helping them develop new products. So I joined them with very much the mandate to help them build a new product and help them innovate into that space. And so I helped them do that. And then went to Iodine.
Okay. How did you enjoy that innovative piece of it?
Yeah, it's a mix of I enjoy it, but it's always hard. It's never easy.
What makes it hard?
You have to learn an entirely new legal framework. And even if you're familiar with like adjacent, ERISA is part of the tax code at a high level, but it's a totally different area. And then especially within that ERISA framework, you're focusing on certain provisions that are relevant to the particular product, and you always have to learn it. And I'm never the subject matter expert in that provision because it's just not my role, but I have to learn it well enough to be able to talk to the experts in those spaces and help have a dialogue with them in terms of what we want to do and how do we best achieve that. And then you have to think of how you do this. And then there's an operational aspect to this, that what is the best legal way to do this is operationally not feasible, right? There's business dynamics, there's commercial dynamics, there's simply operational. We want to do you have to do these 10 steps. And operationally, you simply cannot, you can't get, a patient to do these 10 steps. It's just not real.
Right.
And so then you go back to the drawing board and rethink how you do this. And there's a dialogue there. And then you're trying to deal with different adaptions and trade-offs as you're trying to build products. And so it's always challenging, but it's also at the end, you have something that works. And it's always a feeling of accomplishment that oh, this is totally new, totally novel. And fully defensible. And so it's enjoyable at the end, but it's never easy.
Sure. That makes sense. And then you joined Iodine,
Then I
correct?
joined
Tell us
Iodine.
about that transition.
Yeah, I joined Angle Health and had come with a mandate to do certain things and achieve those things and was ready for the next thing and then joined Iodine. And Iodine was my most recent company. It was recently acquired by Waystar. And at its heart, what it did, and there's all the different adjacencies to it, and I'm sure the real experts at Iodine might quibble with how I characterize it. But effectively, we ingested medical records from healthcare systems. And using those medical records, we could develop AI models that would allow us to analyze medical records and improve them. And you're taking data from across the country, a lot of different healthcare systems, academic to regional, et cetera. And by having that cross section of data, you can then build models that can figure out how to improve the medical record. And a higher quality medical record has two key impacts. One is it supports insurance reimbursements. So if the medical record does not support the insurance reimbursement, they don't get paid. The hospital systems don't get paid. So the record supports that. And then two is we want to prove that with a higher quality medical record, you get better clinical outcomes. And so both are very important for the health of the healthcare system and individuals. But that was the core of the business. And there's other things there's adjacencies to that
Right.
we can get into, but that's fundamentally the core of it.
And when you joined them, you stepped into a senior role and essentially rebuilt the legal function. Is that right?
Yeah. So I would say for all three companies, it was a senior legal role, it was a GC role. And I think the difference with Iodine, it was a more mature company.
Mm-hmm.
And it had been around for 14 years. The other two were startups, so very earlier on in their life cycle. Whereas Iodine had been around for 14 years. It was a mature company, it had PE ownership versus VC ownership, and had relatively recently, built a legal team. My predecessor there had departed for another opportunity, and so there was a lot of internal challenges around managing legal and sort of operating at a high velocity and high quality way. I was with the predecessor departing. It was a period of not working well, and so joining the company, it was very much a mandate to sort of understand what was happening in legal, understand what the company needed, and then um, help get the company into a better position from its legal frameworks, and then just generally support the company's growth. And very explicitly, even when I was interviewing with them, they were thinking about the exit opportunities that may exist and gearing up for that transaction.
So you were there through their acquisition?
That's right. And then I stayed a little bit over, just to help with the transition, smooth the transition over.
What was that like for you to be
It
there during
was,
that time?
I mean, it's doing a transaction is always a lot of work. So
Mm-hmm.
you're doing a lot
Mm-hmm.
of work, plus you have your day job. So it's always very intense. But at the end, it's I wanted to do it. It was a good outcome. It's also like it's a good sense of accomplishment. Like, okay, you had this thing, you've gotten in a good shape. It's other people are seeing it now and seeing all the work you've done and all the things you've done and appreciating it. And so that's always a good feeling, but it's always a lot of work.
Yeah.
And then it's hard. I think it's a big moment of change for a lot of people. Obviously, the acquiring company will be making changes and they have their own culture and dynamics and way of operating. And we were privately held. We were around for 14 years. We were closer to a startup in terms of culture than we were towards like a big public healthcare IT company. And our acquirer was more like it's a public company and it's more of a traditional, what you think of like a traditional public company. And it's a very different culture dynamic. It's a very different operating tempo and style and cadence. And I think that transition is always challenging and hard. And it's also different personalities, different cultures. And so I think people went through, for me, it's a little bit different because obviously as part of the acquisition, even when we were doing the term sheet, like it's always kind of clear that, the senior leadership is typically, like, especially in the G&A, does not roll over. And so that was always known. And so it wasn't, as significant to me, but like, I think the team felt it a lot more. The teams and internal culture, folks feel it a lot more. And so
Right.
it's a bit more emotional for people than
Yes.
people always sometimes expect. There's a lot of emotions involved. There's lots of like uncertainty. There's a lot of fear, anxiety, and you sort of have to help manage those emotions and help
Mm-hmm.
people through that because it is a big moment of change.
Sure. Absolutely. Something we don't really tend to think about, the emotional side. You worked at earlier stage companies and then one that had, 300 or so employees. How do you approach legal team design differently at those different sizes?
I actually don't approach it differently. It's the same approach almost. And it's really rooted in like principles. And fundamentally you're trying to understand what does the business need today at a very fundamental level, and how do we achieve that at the lowest possible cost? Because obviously it's easy to spend money, but you also want to do it in a way that is driving real value.
Mm-hmm.
Because the reality of the situation is being in-house counsel is you are an expense line item. You're not a profit center, and there's always scrutiny. There's always questions about it, and and it's also just not good for the business, right? As a business partner, as a business owner, I've been fortunate to have equity in all my roles. Like I want the business to be successful, and you don't want expenses to be unnecessarily high. And so you always want to be disciplined about it. And so you always start with a really fundamental, like, what does this company need from the legal and compliance and regulatory side to be successful? And you sort of understand that piece first. And then you think about, okay, once you understand that piece, then you slot in what is the best way to achieve that outcome with constrained resources. And the example I'll give at Iodine is, so the team I inherited was 2 contract managers and a paralegal. And I think the challenge that the team faced is they were being asked to do senior commercial counsel work. It was an unfair ask of them. Like they had some like outside counsel support, but it was just an unfair ask of that team. They're being asked to negotiate complex commercial SaaS agreements involving AI and healthcare data with major healthcare systems. And it was just an unfair ask. And so obviously there's a lot of struggles with that. The sales team was unhappy. The finance team was unhappy. There's a lot of teams that were unhappy. Things were taking too long. And it was a high friction point. And so once you understood like these deals are so important and so difficult to negotiate, especially nowadays, that it really made sense to invest in more senior legal talent in-house and then finding the right talent and then think about what the role was. And that, we didn't have like 100 contracts a week, right? We might have a couple contracts to work on a week, but each contract was very complex and very, and so then, and then obviously you're doing your markup and you're passing it on and then you're waiting on, the counterparty to do their markup, and dealing with healthcare systems, the reality is just going to be slower. And so then think about like, okay, what other needs do I have in terms of the company, in terms of like around product innovation and data issues and data rights? So then thinking about, I need someone who can flex on the commercial side, but also operate on the product side. And so then so really thinking about like, what does the company need? In that, like, I don't need 2 people. I'd rather have one person who can flex and pay them more, rather than having 2 people who I pay each person less but can't flex as easily. And so like that's how I think about it. It's really about what does the company need, and like how do I allocate them, and how do I create, especially in earlier stage companies, 300 I think is kind of still smaller size. Like how do you maintain a very nimble and dynamic thing, framework? And then I think once you build the frameworks and standardized frameworks, it's easier then to slot in support from paralegals or contract managers who have very clear playbooks and very clear frameworks. But when you're rebuilding or building from the ground up, I find it's more productive, both across Black companies, to hire more senior on the front end, to help with the building and foundation building. And then once that's built, then hiring folks who can just follow a playbook and don't need that seniority level of judgment.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And you probably hit the right word, nimble. It seems like throughout your career, you've had to be really nimble, and that's made you be pretty successful as well.
Yeah, no, it's like I told you, I never planned on going in-house. I kind of stumbled into it. And when opportunities arise, I try to keep an open mind about different types of roles and opportunities. And, it was an exciting moment. I was like, sure, I've never joined a tech startup and I don't know if I ever will. And then I ended up joining one and I actually really enjoyed it. And I discovered I really enjoyed the energy, the culture, the dynamics, building a business, and especially working in regulated, and this is just me personally, I like working in regulated spaces because legal becomes so embedded in the business decisions. It's so core to the business in terms of how to create new products, how to do, like even the close contract at that major healthcare system, when they're so heavily negotiated because so much is at stake in terms of data rights and AI training, that legal really becomes a driver of value and really becomes a strategy partner to the business versus sort of a check the box function. And so I tend to find that type of like dynamic very interesting and exciting. And so, but I didn't know that, when I was in law school or even before law school, I didn't realize this is the path I would end up, or this is the type of jobs I would like and pursue. So it's keeping an open mind and just seeing what opportunities emerge and then chasing them as they come.
And then I want to shift gears for 1 minute back to Iodine. You were deeply involved in AI governance there. How should in-house lawyers think about AI oversight without stifling innovation?
I think there's a couple different aspects of AI oversight and AI governance. I think one aspect is what I would call it more applicable to most everyone. Maybe quite frankly, everyone these days is how do you buy AI tools and how do you govern AI tools and how do you use AI tools from different vendors? And I think it's this idea of principles-based leadership and thinking in terms of really being like, what do we care most about? Like, what is most important to our business? Now, at Iodine, we cared a lot about two fundamental things: protecting our IP rights and then protecting data privacy. Right? We had a lot of healthcare data. We have like people's medical records. It's very sensitive data, and so those are the two foundational things that we cared the most about. And so then when we look at vendors, we're looking at products, tools. That's what we're looking at. Can these vendors, one, contractually guarantee IP rights and protection and data rights and protection or data protection? But beyond contractually, are these vendors credible? Right? If we're dealing with an Amazon is one conversation versus dealing with, a newer company that doesn't have the reputation for handling this type of like very sensitive and important data. And so it was a sort of dual layer diligence that we might pay a premium and work with vendors who not only commit to these things, but had the reputation of doing so. Quite frankly, when we get diligence by our clients, because we also get diligence, a very common question we get asked is, who are your vendors? Right? It's very common. And who are you working with and where does our data flow? What systems would our data flow through? And so we also have to speak to that too, CISOs and others at healthcare systems. And so it becomes a very important part of our own in terms of what we buy and how we use these tools. And then the other side of it, and this is us being an AI company, is now how do we think about AI governance as an AI company? And it's been an evolution. I think we're seeing the market shift. I think we're seeing the market change. I think, very early on, when AI started heating up as this like buzzy word, all of a sudden, we would get these like addendums to these contracts. And I don't know, I'm just saying this in. It felt like a McKinsey like white paper or like statement or something, or maybe with Deloitte, I don't know who it was. And some consultant had written this thing up, had attached to the contract, being like, attach this to your contracts. And they were just non-actionable. There's like a statement of principle. There's like kind of like, what is this? Like this is not really contractual. We don't have to do with this. It's not really useful. But something we'd agree to, like, okay, we can't really do this, or like it would be like, this is silly. But now over time, I think the whole industry has gotten more mature and more sophisticated. And so now it's more about like governance standards. So there's the NIST framework, there's other frameworks out there, been in the industry and sector. And then we contractually agree to, and so then we internally built those frameworks to support that. And I think what we find is there's a duality of what does the market want from you, right? They demand it from you. They demand these certain governance standards. And then other side of that is like, how do you get ahead of the market? Because when you're dealing with these healthcare systems and dealing with, whoever client it is and who are more sophisticated, they're very concerned about this. And so the more you can get ahead of their concerns and be like, oh yes, we know you have concerns about like how our data flows. By the way, here are our vendors, here's how the process flows, here's how it works, here's the retention, here's all this stuff, here's the technical framework, how this all works. We'll create white papers to support this. And then you sort of jump ahead of their concerns. And maybe at some level, like their concerns can never be fully eliminated. Right, it's high risk, high stakes stuff. But now because you're a thought leader for them, right? Not so like a public thought leader, but like it's an internal like one-on-one thought leader. They get more confident in you, and so then it's like how do you signal your own credibility and your own ability to manage these issues to your customers even before they ask to you? Is that the way I think about AI governance? And so we want to be very intentional and thoughtful and deliberate about moving the needle forward constantly, such that like even if we get like a very high level question, like do you have an AI committee, governance committee, very early on, we were ahead of the curve and had that committee. And who was on that committee? We had the right people on that. And so like it just allowed us to constantly stay ahead of the curve of where the market was catching up to, which allowed us to shorten the sales cycle. Because if there isn't that confidence or there isn't that certainty, it just takes more time for them to get internal alignment, it takes more time for people to get comfortable, they have more follow-up questions. And so AI governance actually has a key impact on the sales cycle about reducing the time it takes to close transactions, especially for like type of transactions we were doing.
Great insight. Really appreciate that summary that you gave us on AI governance. I think a key thing is it's evolving.
Absolutely.
And how you approach it. You gave some really clear advice. Speaking of advice, I want to close out our session by asking you if you were to go back to your younger self in law school and were to give yourself a piece of advice, knowing what you know now, what would that piece of advice be?
It's a more generic advice, but I think it's a very important advice. As a student, you have a and that superpower is people want to talk to you. They want to share their wisdom. And I think the advice I would give is I would be very proactive about reaching out to as many people at any level of seniority just to get their perspective on things. Understand what they do, how they do it, how they think about it, how they see the world, and really allows you to broaden your horizon, broaden your network, broaden your understanding of legal practice or whatever that might be, right? And I think people will like, even I will pick up a phone call, grab a coffee with like a law student or student, and very much just to sort of giving back and help people out. And I think as a student, that's a superpower that, as you get older and more senior career, it's just not as easy as compared to when you're a student. And so that's the one advice I'd give is like, this is your superpower. Like you may not know what's going on. You may not understand anything, but that's okay. Like no one expects you to, but people will talk to you and help you.
Very valuable advice. Appreciate that. Appreciate the time you shared with us. And I really look forward to what's next for you and following you on your career path here on out.
I appreciate the conversation. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.